You think you've seen it all in suburbia until a clipboard queen with a Lexus-sized ego decides to make your driveway her battleground. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the flashing red and blue lights rolled down Maple Crest. I was mid-charge topping off my brand new EV when HOA Karen, real name Valerie Pierce, stood at the curb arms folded, waving her bylaws like the Ten Commandments. "Illegal charger," she barked, pointing at my perfectly permitted setup. The officers stepped out, their faces caught between duty and disbelief. But as they glanced from my tidy charging station to the behemoth SUV idling at the hydrant belching fumes like a chimney, the irony was thick enough to choke on. That was the moment I knew tonight the HOA's house of cards was about to collapse. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Maple Crest wasn't the kind of place where you expected fireworks, at least not the kind that came from police cruisers and HOA hysteria. On the surface, our neighborhood looked like the picture-perfect slice of suburbia: manicured lawns, cookie-cutter houses with shutters painted in regulation-approved earth tones, and driveways wide enough for the kind of cars Karen and her bored cronies adored: massive SUVs with engines that drank gasoline like frat boys at a keg party. I had lived there long enough to know that beneath the tidy hedges and cheerful welcome home signs was a dictatorship armed with clipboards, fines, and the smug assurance that their interpretation of the HOA bylaws outweighed common sense, state law, and sometimes even gravity. And at the center of it all was Karen, real name Valerie Pierce, our self-crowned queen bee. She didn't need a tiara, though. I swear she'd wear one if it came with an HOA logo. What she did have was a laminated copy of the Maple Crest bylaws that she carried like it was the U.S. Constitution itself, only with more highlighting and passive-aggressive sticky notes. My wife Laura always said I had a low tolerance for nonsense. She wasn't wrong. I'd spent my career as an operations manager, which basically meant I had zero patience for inefficiency theatrics or self-appointed monarchs waving their authority around like it was divine right. Still, Laura was the cooler head between us. Ignore her, she'd whisper every time Karen issued one of her absurd proclamations, like when she declared that lawn gnomes were a safety hazard or that unapproved holiday wreaths could distract drivers. But ignoring Karen was like ignoring termites. You might not see the damage right away, but eventually the whole structure comes down. Now let me tell you why the EV charger was such a red rag to her bull. A year before, after watching gas prices climb like a mountain goat on steroids, I sold my old V8 truck and bought an EV. Not out of ideology, not to virtue signal as Karen accused me, but because I was sick of handing half my paycheck to Big Oil every month. Plus my daily commute was a short one. It made sense. I did everything by the book. I hired a licensed electrician, submitted plans to the city, paid for permits, and stood outside sweating in the July sun while the inspector checked the conduit depth and breaker capacity. Green sticker granted. Done deal. Legal, clean, safe. But here's the thing about HOA tyrants: if they can't find a rule, they'll invent one. From the moment Karen spotted the charging cable coiled neatly on the side of my garage, she made it her personal mission to brand me as a neighborhood outlaw. First, she sent me a friendly reminder letter, then a warning of violation. When those didn't stick, she marched up to my driveway herself, sunglasses perched like a general surveying enemy territory, and snapped photos. "You're setting a dangerous precedent," she said, her tone dripping with faux concern. "If everyone installs these, the grid will collapse." I tried explaining that my charger was on a dedicated 40-amp circuit, fully inspected. She waved me off. "I'll be discussing this with the board." Now, the board of Maple Crest was really just Karen and 3 neighbors she'd strong-armed into compliance: Doug, who wore his HOA safety vest like it was a badge of honor; Pat, who once fined a neighbor for leaving their trash can out for 14 minutes past deadline; and Sheila, whose primary qualification was owning the loudest leaf blower in North America. They nodded along to whatever Karen declared like a Greek chorus of disapproval. It wasn't long before word spread that Karen was drafting a new amendment: no outdoor charging of electric vehicles due to aesthetic and fire hazard concerns. You had to love the hypocrisy. Her 3-car garage overflowed with lawn equipment and storage bins, so she parked her tank-sized SUV permanently on the curb. It was always idling, belching smoke as she supervised the neighborhood. But sure, my silent, clean charger was the hazard. Neighbors whispered their frustrations. "She fined me for a hose left out," one said. "She made me repaint my shutters because the beige was too beige," another complained. Everyone had a Karen story, but no one wanted to stand up. Fear was her real power. She fed on it. That's where I was different. See, I've dealt with corporate audits, government inspectors, and union reps all in the same week. I knew how to keep paperwork neat, how to quote code sections, and most importantly, how to stay calm when someone puffed up like a blowfish. Karen wasn't prepared for someone who actually understood rules better than she did. Still, her obsession grew. She snapped more photos, filed complaints with the city, all dismissed, and finally made the nuclear call. She dialed the non-emergency police line and claimed I was running an illegal electrical connection endangering public safety. And that's how we ended up with squad cars rolling down our perfect little cul-de-sac neighbors, gathering with phones out like they were front row at a circus, and Karen pointing at my Charger like she'd just uncovered the crime of the century. I stood there in my driveway, arms crossed, watching the drama unfold. Deep down, I wasn't worried. I had every document, every permit, every inspection approval in a neat folder inside. But I also knew this wasn't just about the Charger. This was about power, Karen's power. And the thing about people like her, the tighter they grip, the faster everything slips through their fingers. What none of us realized in that moment, least of all Karen, was that her own SUV parked illegally by the hydrant was about to become the fuse that lit her whole empire on fire. The funny thing about trouble is that it rarely arrives with a whisper. No, in my experience, it comes blaring down the street with flashing lights and sirens, muted but ready. That Tuesday afternoon, as neighbors leaned against their porches pretending not to watch a black and white cruiser, turned onto Maple Crest and rolled straight for my driveway. Karen was already there waiting, like a cat who dragged in a dead mouse to show off. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched, high lips pursed so tight you'd think she was auditioning for a lemon commercial. She gestured frantically as the officers stepped out, pointing toward my garage wall, as if she'd uncovered some high-stakes narcotics lab instead of a gray metal charging unit the size of a toaster. "There. That's the hazard I reported," she said, voice pitched just a little too loud, ensuring every neighbor heard. "Unauthorized electrical equipment. Could spark a fire. Could kill children." I bit back a laugh. Children. My driveway hadn't seen a child since Halloween, and even then most of the kids skipped our cul-de-sac because Karen once yelled at a 7-year-old for dropping a candy wrapper. The taller of the two officers, badge gleaming in the sun, gave me a measured look. "Sir, can we ask you a few questions about your setup?" "Of course," I said smoothly, "but you'll want to see this first." I ducked into the garage, returned with a tidy binder I'd assembled for precisely this moment. Years of dealing with auditors had taught me the golden rule: when the storm comes, bring receipts. Inside were copies of my city permit, the inspection sign-off with the green sticker diagrams, and even the electrician's license number. I handed it over like I was presenting the winning poker hand. The shorter officer flipped through brow, lifting slightly. "This is thorough." Karen lunged forward. "Don't be fooled, he's siphoning grid power." My lights flickered last week, and it's because of his illegal extension. I raised an eyebrow. Or maybe it was because your SUV idled outside for an hour with the headlights on while you watched everyone mow their lawns. A couple of neighbors chuckled under their breath. Karen spun on them, glare sharp enough to peel paint, but the officers were already radioing dispatch to confirm my permit number. While we waited, Karen kept piling on accusations. He didn't get HOA approval. That alone makes it illegal. I smiled. The city trumps the HOA on safety matters. I submitted the request to you 3 months ago. You ignored it. That's why I went directly through the city, which is allowed by law. The taller officer's lips twitched. Not a smile exactly, but the kind of restrained reaction cops have when they know the caller's credibility is unraveling. Then came the moment that shifted the atmosphere. As the officer closed my binder, his gaze drifted past me to where Karen's beloved SUV sat rumbling on the curb. Big, shiny, monstrous, and illegally parked right in front of the fire hydrant. Steam puffed from the tailpipe like a dragon that hadn't brushed its teeth. He squinted, then asked casually, "Ma'am, is that your vehicle?" Karen's chin lifted. "Yes, officer. That's my family's car." "Why?" "No reason. Just making note of it." He scribbled something in his pad. Her posture stiffened. Dispatch confirmed my permit a moment later. Everything checks out. Installation passed inspection, permitted compliant. I gave Karen a polite shrug, as if to say nice try, but Karen wasn't done. Oh no, not by a mile. She launched into a speech about Transformers overloading neighborhood aesthetics and how gas vehicles are safer because they've stood the test of time. She waved her clipboard so wildly that one of her sticky notes peeled off and floated onto the asphalt like a defeated flag. The officers let her vent for a bit, then one held up a hand. "Ma'am, your concerns about aesthetics fall under HOA jurisdiction, not law enforcement. From what we see here, this installation is legal." Neighbors started murmuring again, phones angled to record every juicy second. You could practically hear the TikTok captions writing themselves HOA Karen versus How. Science Round 1. Karen's face reddened. "This isn't over," she hissed. "The board will have its say." "Sure," I said lightly, "but state law will have the final word." The officer who'd noted her SUV walked toward it slowly, circling, jotting more notes. Karen followed, protesting, "Oh, don't worry about that, it's fine there just for a minute." Except it wasn't fine. Everyone knew the hydrant zone was a no parking area, painted bright red, and her registration sticker faded months expired. The irony wasn't just thick, it was choking. I leaned against my garage, arms folded, watching it unfold. My Charger hummed quietly behind me, innocent as a sleeping cat, while Karen's Fortress on wheels sat exposed as the real hazard. That was when I realized the police visit wasn't the climax, it was just the opening act. Karen thought she'd summoned reinforcements to take me down. In reality, she'd just invited the very people who would unravel her entire facade. And oh, how quickly it would unravel. If Karen had been smart, she would have cut her losses that day. She could have swallowed the embarrassment of the police confirming my Charger was legal and retreated to her fortress of bylaws. But Karen was never one to retreat. No, she believed in escalation. When a normal person saw a brick wall, they stopped. When Karen saw a brick wall, she brought out a clipboard and insisted the wall was non-compliant with neighborhood aesthetics. The very next morning, every mailbox in Maple Crest had a fresh sheet of paper stuffed inside. At first glance, it looked like one of her usual community reminders. But when I unfolded it, I nearly choked on my coffee. Emergency HOA Rule #27B Outdoor charging of electric vehicles is strictly prohibited effective immediately due to safety hazards and aesthetic concerns. Below it in bold were the penalties: $250 fine per day for violations escalating to lien placement after 30 days. It was classic Karen: create a rule out of thin air, label it an emergency, and hope everyone was too scared or too lazy to question its legitimacy. Most people sighed, rolled their eyes, and hid the letter under a stack of coupons. But me, I sharpened my pencil. I knew exactly where to look: state law. See, a few years earlier, the legislature had passed a right-to-charge statute. HOAs could regulate placement, make sure your Charger wasn't blocking a sidewalk or dripping oil onto a neighbor's roses, but they couldn't outright ban EV charging if it was up to code. And mine was not only up to code, it was practically a model installation. So I printed out the statute, highlighted the key sections, and stapled it right next to Karen's so-called emergency rule. Then I went one better. I emailed the entire neighborhood with a calm, professional explanation. "Dear neighbors," I wrote, "please be aware that state law protects residents' right to install and operate EV charging stations if compliant with safety codes. Attached are the relevant statutes, my city permit, and inspection documents. HOA cannot overrule state law. Do not be intimidated by unlawful threats of fines." Within hours, my inbox pinged with replies. Some were cautious: "Are you sure this is true?" Others were relieved: "Thank you, I thought I was going crazy." And a few were downright gleeful. Finally, someone standing up to her. Karen, of course, did not appreciate my little civics lesson. That afternoon, she stormed up my driveway, waving her clipboard like it was Excalibur. "You can't just email the neighborhood without board approval," she snapped. "Actually," I said, leaning casually against my garage, "the bylaws say nothing about private correspondence between homeowners, and freedom of speech is still a thing, last I checked." Her jaw tightened. "You're undermining my authority." I almost laughed. "Karen, your authority ends where state law begins." Now, if there's one thing I learned from years in operations, it's this: details matter. So I walked her through my setup like I was giving a tour. Breaker panel with a dedicated 40-amp circuit check. UL listed Charger check. Conduit run underground to exact depth per code check. GFCI protection check. Shut-off switch within arm's reach, double check. I could see the steam rising from her ears as I rattled off technical jargon. She hated that I knew more than she did. And nothing enrages a self-appointed queen like being reminded her crown is made of cheap plastic. Still, she tried to rally. "The board will vote to fine you." "Be my guest," I said. "Because when those fines get challenged in court, the HOA will be the one paying legal fees, not me." Her lips pursed tighter than ever. She spun on her heel and stomped off SUV, roaring as she drove away, ironically burning more gas in that tantrum than my car would use in a week. But here's the thing, she didn't just stop at letters and threats. Oh no. She had another card to play. The following week, she announced an emergency board meeting at the clubhouse. On the agenda, addressing the growing EV threat. I showed up with a folder so thick it could have doubled as a weapon. Inside were not only my permits and statutes but also every email I'd sent her about approval requests, emails she had ignored. I even printed screenshots of her dismissive one-line replies like, "We'll discuss this later." The room was packed. Neighbors filled the chairs, some standing in the back, phones out to record. Karen stood at the front, basking in the attention. Her allies sat beside her like a trio of bobbleheads. She began with a dramatic speech. "Ladies and gentlemen, our neighborhood is under threat. This homeowner's reckless installation endangers us all. Transformers could blow. Fires could start. Property values will plummet. Do you want Maple Crest to become a junkyard of dead batteries and charred homes?" Gasps rippled through the room, though I noticed more than a few smirks. I waited until she finished, then raised my hand. "May I?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded, certain she could outshout me if needed. I stood, unfolded the state statute like it was the Declaration of Independence, and read aloud, "No common interest development may prohibit or unreasonably restrict the installation of an electric vehicle charging station." Silence. Then murmurs. Then from the back, "Wait, so she can't actually ban it?" I turned to the crowd. "Correct. She can regulate placement, require permits, which I have, but she cannot ban it." I held up my inspection approval like a trophy. "This installation is 100% legal." Karen's face turned crimson. She fumbled through her clipboard, pulling out a graph she claimed showed increased line loss in the neighborhood. I recognized it immediately. It was a screenshot from a random blog about national power grids, not Maple Crest. "Karen," I said, voice calm, "but cutting this has nothing to do with our neighborhood. It's not even from our utility provider." Laughter broke out. Someone whispered, "She Googled it." That was the crack in the dam. The board's bobbleheads shifted uncomfortably. Neighbors started muttering openly. And the officers from the previous call, one of them had stopped by off-duty and was quietly shaking his head in the back. Karen tried to regain control, shouting over the noise, but it was too late. The paper she'd clung to so desperately had just backfired. For the first time in years, I saw doubt flicker in the crowd. Doubt in Karen. Doubt in the board. And I knew that her empire of fines and threats was about to come crashing down. If Karen thought she had won the war with her so-called emergency rule, the board meeting should have been her victory parade. Instead, it was the moment she stumbled and the cracks began to widen. The board never actually voted on her proposal that night. Too many neighbors were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, whispering, and in some cases outright laughing. The once invincible queen of Maple Crest was wobbling on her throne. Still, she tried to leave with her chin high, convinced she could recover in the days ahead. But life has a funny way of setting the stage for poetic justice. And in this case, the stage was her beloved SUV. Now let me paint you a picture. Karen's SUV wasn't just a car, it was a monument. Black paint polished to a mirror, shine chrome trim, glaring in the sunlight, and bumper stickers announcing her support for neighborhood order. She parked it everywhere, sometimes across two spaces, sometimes directly in front of hydrants, and always with the engine idling as if silence itself offended her. That beast was parked outside during the board meeting, angled just a little too close to the bright red curb where the hydrant stood like a silent witness. When the meeting ended, neighbors streamed out and saw it. The murmurs started immediately. Phones came up. Photos snapped. "She's been parked like that for weeks," one neighbor whispered. "Isn't that illegal?" another asked. It didn't take long for someone to make the call. 2 nights later, I was back in my driveway when the familiar sight of headlights swept across the street. Not one cruiser this time, too. The same officers from before stepped out. Their flashlights flicked toward my Charger, then swung to Karen's SUV, which once again squatted in front of the hydrant, rumbling like a caffeinated bulldog. Karen bustled out in her robe and slippers, barking at them before they could speak. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly." "He's still charging illegally." She jabbed a finger toward my garage. The taller officer sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Ma'am, we already confirmed his installation is permitted and compliant. It's legal." Karen's eyes darted. But it's ugly. It lowers property values." The shorter officer tilted his head. "Ma'am, aesthetics aren't a police matter. But do you know what is?" He pointed his flashlight directly at her SUV. "That." Karen blinked. "What about it? Parked in front of a hydrant. That's a violation." Her face drained of color. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. It's just temporary." The officer crouched, tapping the faded registration sticker on her windshield. "Expired. 5 months overdue. That's another violation." I leaned casually against my garage, arms folded, savoring the moment. Around us, neighbors had gathered like spectators at a street performance. Cameras were rolling. One even whispered, "This is better than Netflix." Karen's voice rose in pitch. "This is harassment. He's bribed you, hasn't he?" The taller officer frowned. Ma'am, accusing law enforcement of bribery without evidence is a serious claim. He flipped open his ticket book. Step back, please. And just like that, the pen scratched across paper. Citation 1, blocking emergency access. Citation 2, expired registration. Citation 3, improper display of a temporary placard that had clearly overstayed its welcome. The neighborhood gasped as if watching a high-stakes boxing match. Karen flailed. You can't do this. I'm the president of the HOA. The officer didn't even look up. That doesn't make you exempt from traffic laws. It was glorious. Still, I knew Karen. She wasn't the type to crumble at the first blow. No, she doubled down. Even as she clutched the tickets like they were death warrants, she spun on the crowd. This is a conspiracy. He's dangerous. He's stealing electricity and ruining our neighborhood. But this time, the crowd didn't nod. They didn't look away in fear. They whispered, they chuckled, and some outright rolled their eyes. The spell was breaking. I could almost feel the power shifting in the air. The officer handed her the last slip of paper. You'll need to resolve these citations with the city. Failure to do so may result in towing. He shut his ticket book with a snap. Karen sputtered. Towing? You wouldn't dare, ma'am, he said flatly. We don't tow. The fire department does. And with that, the officers walked back to their cruisers, leaving Karen fuming in the glow of her SUV's headlights. I stayed silent, but inside my chest, fireworks went off. For years, she had lorded her clipboard over us, wielding fines like a sword. And now, the same rulebook she'd twisted against us was being used against her. Later that night, Laura leaned over and whispered, "Don't get cocky. She's going to retaliate." She was right. Karen's pride was her engine, and humiliation was the fuel that made it roar. The next morning, my inbox pinged with a mass HOA email from her. Subject line, Neighborhood Safety Alert. Inside, she accused me of endangering the community with unapproved power consumption. She painted herself as the victim of harassment by biased law enforcement. And then she dropped the bomb, an announcement for another emergency board hearing to address ongoing criminal behavior. Criminal behavior from a legal inspected city-permitted charger. If it hadn't been so absurd, it would have been insulting. But I wasn't angry. I was energized. Because while she thought she was tightening the noose, she had no idea. I was already gathering the rope that would hang her entire regime. What Karen didn't realize was that paper works both ways. She had her clipboards, her fake emergency rules, her desperate emails. But I had something far sharper: receipts. And soon the receipts would expose her not just as a petty tyrant, but as something far worse. Karen always believed she could bury me under paper. Letters, citations, emergency rules, mass emails, all of it was part of her arsenal. She assumed if she buried me in enough bureaucracy, I'd eventually wave the white flag. What she didn't count on was that I knew how to use paper too. And unlike her, mine came stamped with city seals, state statutes, and signatures that actually mattered. After the night of her SUV citations, she doubled down. The safety alert email she blasted out to the neighborhood was almost comical. She accused me of illegal energy siphoning and warned of rolling blackouts caused by reckless charging. Rolling blackouts. My little EV charger was drawing less power than half the neighborhood's air conditioners. But fear was Karen's favorite currency. She hoped if she shouted fire in a crowded theater, everyone would panic and blame me. Instead, something else happened. Neighbors started calling me. Not to accuse, but to confide. "Hey," whispered Dan from down the street. "She fined me last year for a lawn violation that never existed. Said my grass was too dense. I paid it because I didn't want trouble. She nailed me for leaving my holiday lights up too long," said Marissa. "I was 2 days late. She threatened a lien on my house. Story after story spilled out. Patterns of intimidation, petty fines, and rules invented on the fly. For years, everyone had grumbled in private, but no one had dared stand up. And now, suddenly, I was the guy holding the flashlight showing the cracks in the system. I decided to dig deeper. Using the state's public records portal, I filed a request for HOA expense reports. It took a couple of weeks, but when the packet arrived, it was like Christmas morning. Line items jumped off the page: community security fuel reimbursements signed by none other than Karen herself. Reimbursements every single week in amounts that eerily matched local gas station receipts. One line in particular made me snort out loud: $143.28. Security Patrol fuel, approved by HOA President. Security Patrol Maplecrest had no security patrol. The only patrol was Karen cruising the neighborhood in her gas-guzzling monument clipboard in one hand, iced coffee in the other. She was literally billing the HOA for her joyrides. And it wasn't just fuel. There were purchases for safety equipment that looked suspiciously like bulk orders of reflective vests. There were reimbursements for maintenance supplies that coincided with Karen's personal Home Depot hauls. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, disguised under the veneer of official-sounding categories. I knew then what had to be done. When the emergency board hearing finally rolled around, the clubhouse was overflowing. Word had spread that the police had ticketed Karen's SUV, and the neighborhood was buzzing with curiosity. People wanted blood, or at least a good show. Karen strutted in like nothing had happened. Clipboards stacked allies Doug, Pat, and Sheila, trailing behind her like nervous foot soldiers. She launched straight into her performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice ringing out, "we are gathered to address a grave threat. This homeowner continues to flout HOA rules, endanger our safety, and undermine our community values." I let her rant for 5 minutes. Then, when she finally took a breath, I raised my hand. "I'd like to respond," I said. She sneered. "You'll have your turn." Briefly. I stood, placed my folder on the podium, and opened it with deliberate calm. "Neighbors, I'd like to remind you that state law protects our right to install EV chargers if they're up to code. My charger is permitted, inspected, and fully legal. Here are the documents again." I held them up for all to see. Murmurs spread through the crowd. A few people clapped softly. But that's not all. I continued. "Because, while Karen has been accusing me of theft, I've discovered something interesting in the HOA's own financial records." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" I flipped to the first page. Line item, security patrol fuel. Weekly reimbursements signed by Karen, totaling nearly $6,000 over the past 2 years. Gasps rippled through the room. "We don't have a security patrol," I said evenly. "Unless you count Karen's personal SUV." Karen's face went pale, then red. "That's a lie. Those are legitimate expenses." I flipped to another page. Safety equipment, $429. 12 reflective vests billed as emergency gear. To my knowledge, we've never held an emergency drill, never distributed vests. Has anyone here received one? Silence. No hands raised. I pressed on. "Neighbors, I think it's time we ask, where is our money actually going?" The room erupted in whispers, anger bubbling to the surface. For years, people had written checks to the HOA without question. Now they were realizing those checks might have been fueling Karen's personal gas tank. Karen slammed her clipboard on the podium. "This is slander. I have dedicated my life to protecting this neighborhood." From the back, someone shouted, "Protecting it from what? Holiday lights?" Laughter broke out. Even her allies looked rattled. Doug shifted in his chair, Sheila avoided eye contact, and Pat fiddled nervously with her pen. The board wasn't a united front anymore. It was a sinking ship, and the captain was losing her grip. I delivered the final blow. "I'm formally requesting an independent audit of the HOA's finances per Section 8 of the bylaws. And since we have a quorum here tonight, I'm also calling for a vote of no confidence in the current president." The room fell silent for half a beat. Then someone clapped, then another, and suddenly the clubhouse was filled with applause. Karen's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping on the dock. She sputtered about conspiracies, about vendettas, about me being a radical energy zealot. But the tide had turned. The neighbors weren't afraid anymore. They were angry. And nothing scared Karen more than a crowd that stopped believing her. That night, the board didn't vote me out. Instead, they voted to authorize an audit. For the first time in Maple Crest history, Karen didn't get her way. Walking home under the glow of streetlights, Laura squeezed my hand. "You realize you just declared war, right?" I smiled. "War was declared the moment she called the cops on me. Tonight we just fired back." The vote for an independent audit was like lighting a fuse in a fireworks factory. For years, Karen had strutted around Maple Crest as if her clipboard were a crown and her SUV a chariot. Now, for the first time, her kingdom was under siege, not from outsiders, but from her own subjects. And the thing about tyrants is they never believe their subjects will turn on them. Within a week, the auditors were in. A local accounting firm hired through neighbor donations, not HOA funds, much to Karen's fury. I half expected her to chain herself to the clubhouse door to stop them, but even she knew better than to get in the way of accountants with clipboards bigger than hers. What they uncovered wasn't just embarrassing, it was devastating. Gas receipts reimbursed as security fuel. Home Depot purchases coded as community maintenance. A subscription to some bizarre neighborhood watch software that turned out to be a streaming service. Karen had logged into 76 times. And perhaps most damning, reimbursement checks written directly to her husband for emergency landscaping. Emergency landscaping, What emergency requires $2,000 worth of mulch in November? When the auditors presented their preliminary findings at the next meeting, the room was packed tighter than a Black Friday sale. Karen sat at the front, jaw clenched, clutching her clipboard like a shield. The lead auditor, a bespectacled woman with the patience of a saint, clicked through her slides. We have identified multiple instances of questionable expenditures, lacking supporting documentation. These include, but are not limited to. She rattled off the list: fuel reimbursements, suspicious Home Depot runs, bulk vest purchases, software subscriptions. Gasps, whispers, outright laughter. Karen leapt to her feet. This is a witch hunt. You don't understand the responsibilities of an HOA president. The auditor raised an eyebrow. I understand financial records. And these are irregular. From the back of the room, a neighbor shouted, "So, my fine for painting my shutters was paying for your gas. Another, you threatened to tow my car, but you've been billing us for your SUV." The room boiled over. Phones shot up to record. Karen's face flushed crimson as she shouted back, "This is slander I sacrificed for you, ungrateful people." That's when I knew she was finished. When a leader starts calling their followers ungrateful, the reign is already over. Still, she tried one last desperate move. She pulled out a color-printed chart from her clipboard, waving it like a magic spell. "Here, proof that his charger is destabilizing the grid. Look at this spike. The chart looks suspiciously familiar." My eyes narrowed. I pulled out my phone, typed a few words, and there it was, the exact same chart on some random energy blog from 2012. She'd literally downloaded an image and passed it off as evidence. I raised my voice. "Neighbors, that chart isn't from our utility. It's from a blog post about national line loss over a decade old." The crowd erupted again, this time with laughter that rolled like thunder. Even her own allies, Doug, Pat, and Sheila, looked mortified. Doug muttered something about needing to step back, and Sheila excused herself to the restroom, never to return. And then came the knockout punch. The police officer from Part 3, who had quietly slipped into the back, raised his hand. The room fell silent as he stood. "For the record," he said, voice calm but firm, "I personally inspected the installation at this residence. It is compliant with code, permitted, and safe. Furthermore, I issued citations to Miss Pierce's vehicle for violations witnessed firsthand. Those citations stand." Boom. That was it. The silence stretched a beat too long before the murmurs started, then the voices, then the chants. "Vote her out, vote her out." Karen's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. She slammed her clipboard on the table. "You'll regret this. You'll all regret this," she shrieked before storming toward the exit. But the damage was done. 2 of the board members resigned on the spot. The third called for an immediate vote of no confidence. Papers rustled, ballots, scribbled, hands raised. It was unanimous. Karen was stripped of her presidency that night. Years of fear, fines, and petty power plays evaporated in a single hour of collective courage. The neighbors who had once whispered now shouted. The silent majority had found its voice. I walked home under the streetlights with Laura beside me, her hand in mine. "You did it," she said softly. I shook my head. We did it. All it took was one person standing up, and the rest realized they could too. But deep down, I knew the story wasn't quite finished. Karen wasn't the type to vanish quietly, and while she no longer held the crown, she still had her SUV, her bitterness, and her endless supply of rage. I suspected she'd try one last play, and when she did, I would be ready. When Karen stormed out of that meeting, clipboard clutched to her chest like a life preserver, most people assumed we'd seen the last of her. After all, being stripped of the HOA presidency was the ultimate humiliation. For someone who lived for control, losing the board was like losing oxygen. But Karen was never the type to go quietly. For a week or two, Maple Crest basked in the calm. The new interim board, led by a retired fire captain named Arthur, got straight to work. He was the polar opposite of Karen, calm, practical, allergic to drama. Within days, he repainted the hydrant curbs bright red, enforced actual parking rules, and announced common-sense policies on EV chargers. "As long as it's safe and permitted," he said at the next meeting, "you're good to go." Neighbors applauded. Some even asked about installing chargers of their own. It felt like a new era, like we'd finally broken free of the tyranny of clipboards and arbitrary fines. Then the letter arrived. A thick envelope addressed to the Maple Crest community. Inside was Karen's magnum opus, a 10-page screed typed in 12-point Times New Roman, single-spaced, titled "An Appeal to Justice." In it, she accused me of conspiring with the police, the auditors, and even the utility company. She claimed I was part of a radical energy movement trying to overthrow traditional values. And she insisted the vote to remove her was illegal, demanding reinstatement. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so pathetic. But buried in the rant was something more telling, a scanned application she'd submitted months earlier trying to register the HOA as an official neighborhood emergency authority. Her goal: to give herself power to issue parking permits, enforce curfews, and get this control access to utilities in times of crisis. The application had been denied by the city, stamped in bold red, "Not approved." That was the final nail. Arthur, level-headed as always, called another meeting. He laid out the facts. Karen had attempted to elevate herself from neighborhood president to quasi-police chief, all under the guise of safety. Her gas reimbursements, her phony emergency rules, her wild accusations, it all fit the same pattern: control at any cost. The neighbors were done. Some laughed, some shook their heads in disbelief, but nobody defended her. Even Doug, her most loyal lieutenant, muttered, "I should have known," before voting to permanently bar her from ever holding HOA office again. Karen didn't attend. Rumor had it she was busy fighting her traffic citations in municipal court. Rumor also said she lost. Meanwhile, life in Maple Crest slowly shifted. The board approved a grant application for shared EV outlets at the clubhouse. People started walking to each other's houses without fear of being fined for unauthorized foot traffic. Holiday lights went up early, and no one got a citation. The air felt lighter, literally, since Karen's SUV wasn't idling at the curb anymore. One evening, as the sun set behind rows of freshly trimmed hedges, I stood in my driveway watching my EV hum quietly on the charger. A neighbor strolled by, stroller in tow, and smiled. "Funny," he said, nodding toward the charger. "That thing's caused more drama than a Netflix show." I chuckled. "Yeah, but it also saved us." Because here's the twist most people didn't see coming. Karen's downfall wasn't really about my EV. The charger was just the spark. What brought her empire down was her own SUV, her own greed, her own need to control every blade of grass and every watt of power. She wanted to make me the villain. Instead, she wrote her own ending. A few months later, a for sale sign appeared in her yard. The SUV was still there, angled awkwardly in the driveway, registration sticker peeling. She'd lost the presidency, the respect of the neighborhood, and the battle in traffic court. Word spread that she was moving to a community with higher standards. When the realtor's sign leaned slightly to one side, no one bothered to fix it. It stayed tilted, a quiet symbol of poetic justice in a neighborhood finally free from tyranny. I won't pretend I was the hero who single-handedly toppled her. The truth is, it took all of us neighbors who stopped being afraid, who spoke up, who realized the HOA didn't belong to one person with a clipboard, but to everyone who lived there. Still, I'll admit it, every time I plug in my car now, I allow myself a small, satisfied smile. My charger hums quietly, green light glowing. And in the silence I can almost hear the faint echo of her SUV sputtering away for the last time. Looking back, this wasn't just about an EV charger or one woman's oversized SUV. It was about what happens when power goes unchecked and how ordinary people can reclaim it. For years, Karen ruled Maple Crest through fear, intimidation, and paperwork no one dared question. But the moment neighbors stood together, her empire crumbled like a sandcastle against the tide. There's a lesson in that. Bullies, whether they sit on playground swings or HOA boards, thrive only when we stay silent. The second we shine light on their behavior, they lose their grip. Courage isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about standing steady, keeping receipts, and refusing to bend when you know you're in the right. I won't lie, facing her was exhausting. But what came after was worth every ounce of stress. Our neighborhood became lighter, freer, more human. We stopped living under the weight of arbitrary rules and started looking out for each other again. And maybe that's the real victory, not just beating Karen at her own game, but proving that community works best when it's built on trust, not fear. So, let me ask you, have you ever faced a Karen in your own life, HOA or otherwise? Drop your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this tale of drama, justice, and a little bit of revenge, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because trust me, the next HOA story is already on its way.